Hi everyone, I am Arman Noroozian and I'll be giving a quick overview of our study into whether ISPs can help mitigate IoT malware. This is joint work with Elsa Rodriguez, Elmer Lastdrager, Takahiro Kasama, Michel van Eeten and Carlos Ganan. So we all know about the growing influx of IoT devices into our markets as they're becoming more popular, and projections show that by 2025, we'll be seeing 30 billions of devices according to some marketing firms. Many of these devices raise security and privacy concerns. For example, they come with poor hard-coded passwords, they lack firmware update mechanisms, or use insecure communication, to name a few examples here. And as a result, many are being actively exploited by IoT malware like Mirai, Bashlight, and Satori, and other ones being recruited into botnets and then used to launch DDoS attacks to evade detection or proxies or as stepping stones to other types of cybercrime. So in terms of the remedies that we are exploring as a community, bluntly stated, we have a lot of processes that are slow and take quite some time to take effect. For example, we have been looking into monitoring and transparency, where many organizations are tracking infections and reporting them. There's awareness raising, where we've heard about teddy bears and toasters being insecure as part of these efforts. There are certifications and standards to require minimum security requirements for manufactured devices, or security labels to indicate the privacy and security risks when these devices are being purchased. And on the legal side, manufacturer and vendor liability to divert the societal cost of the insecurity of these devices back to manufacturers and vendors, and even strengthening end user rights, for example, a right to return devices if they're insecure to where they're purchased from. But the elephant in the room is what do we do until these mechanisms take effect? And so when we look at the actors in this space, one of the actors that has quite a significant role are ISPs, and they have a critical role here because partly they have been historically fighting things like botnets, configure and spam botnets from decades ago are examples here. And they also have the ability to combat infections because they can actually see them. They can even detect IoT devices in their networks according to recent studies, and they're essentially gatekeepers to connecting devices and people to the internet. So when it comes to their role, they potentially have even the incentive to combat IoT malware. Recent studies show that 87% of infected IoT devices are actually in broadband networks. And recent events also show that a lot of the exploited devices are actually the routers owned by the same telecom companies and broadband providers. Deutsche Telekom's network failure is an example that comes to mind here. So the other factor here is that they also have a lot of security practices at their disposal, some of which are known to be effective against IoT malware. For example, quarantining the networks that have infected IoT devices in them have been shown to be effective. But when it comes to quarantining, this is a very costly and difficult to scale operation. It requires a customer help center, which is something difficult to scale. There will be angry customers and many that require help. So what else can ISPs do effectively here? And our study looks into two additional strategies. One is, does reducing the IoT attack surface help here? And the other is, do the existing remediation practices or abuse remediation practices that they already have in place work against IoT malware? So we limit our study to Mirai and Mirai-like malware because they're a suitable case study here. Mirai is still among the major IoT malware families, and many other IoT malware are derivatives of its source code. Mirai, like malware, are easier to track, partly because they have an aggressive scanning pattern to infect other devices, and they have a unique network traffic fingerprint that's quite easy to detect. They are also easier to clean up because it's non-persistent, and basically turning a device on and off will remove it. And there's also a lot of abuse and threat intel data shared by organizations like Shadow Server and Spamhaus with ISPs, which they can use in this combat. So basically, if ISPs cannot mitigate Mirai and Mirai-like malware with such properties, it's unlikely that they'll be able to do so for more sophisticated IoT malware. So in terms of our study setup, essentially what we do is model how changes in the number of Mirai infections in broadband networks correlate with the IoT attack surface and changes in their network hygiene and security efforts to remediate other types of malware, for instance. The two plots on the right-hand side are examples of the type of data that we have collected. Blue lines indicating Mirai infections over time within different ISPs, broadband ISPs, and red lines indicating, for example, reductions in attack surface by, for example, closing telnet ports or FTP ports, which are services that Mirai uses to propagate itself. Our study is essentially a longitudinal study where we have collected Mirai infection data from before its inception point all the way up to May 2020. And we use a host of other data summarized in this table, which you can refer to the paper for more details of the data. Some of the empirical results from our study are that we find that Mirai infections moderately to strongly correlate with the number of ISP subscribers. Basically, more subscribers means more IoT devices that can be infected. And we also see similar results with respect to the attack surface and network hygiene. We also find evidence that many ISPs actually did try to reduce the attack surface for Mirai-like malware. And essentially, when we build our models, we are looking at a modeling of the number of Mirai-like infections within broadband networks correlated with institutional factors, properties of the attack surface and network hygiene of each ISP, and efforts to reduce this attack surface and improve the generic hygiene of their network. Basically, what you see here is a graphical illustration of the regression models that we built. So in terms of the questions that we posed, does attack surface reduction correlate with less Mirai infections? Surprisingly, we find no evidence to support this. In terms of whether improving network hygiene correlates with less Mirai infections, we find that the answer is yes. And so here we have a positive result that shows that ISPs can actually have a role to play here. So some of the takeaways are that first, a lack of evidence to support attack surface reduction does not mean that it's a useless endeavor. Basically, one of the possible explanations is that Mirai variants have moved on to using alternative exploitation and propagation mechanisms. And the other takeaway is that we actually did find that ISPs can play a role here, basically indicating that the best practices which they have in place to fight other types of malware can also be effective against IoT malware. Essentially, also ISPs have several countermeasures at their disposal here. They can look at better protecting customer networks by closing ports by default, setting stronger initial passwords on equipment, and firewall rules that prevent mass-scale port scanning, for instance. And they can look into their abuse handling processes by notifying infection customers or quarantining the infected networks, or even updating equipment and firmware if possible. So the final takeaway actually is that despite the effective role that they can play here, we should not be distracted from the root cause of this problem and our efforts to address the main cause, which is the poor security practices of IoT manufacturers. So I hope that you have a more detailed look at our paper, and I look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A session.